to be here. I think I want to reflect for a moment on one of the words that Kate was using earlier, and that is variability. When we start talking about water resources and drought and temperature in streams, that's really what we're talking about. We're talking about how we are going to be departing from the norm, how we already have departed from the norm, and how we really don't know how the landscape and the waterscape of what we're walking into. It is going to be different. Of that, we can be assured. There are going to be times when there's not enough. There's going to be time when there's way too much in the water's course. Our past systems of adapting can continue to work as long as they're like what I'll call chronic changes, ones that move us slowly towards a path. You know, we can be the frogs in the frying pan when hopefully we'll get out before we get fried, but we can make that adaptation. What we don't do well is we don't do good response to a massive swing on a short-term or a long-term basis unless we've thought about it beforehand. And that's what we're going to be talking about today, is how can we really start to think about dealing with those significant changes as they're going to be coming to us over time. I'm happy today to be joined here on the podium with four great people who will be talking to us from many different perspectives. I'll introduce them all individually as we come up, but just briefly, we have John Bernardo from Idaho Power Company. We have Lynn Tominaga from the Idaho Groundwater Appropriators. We have Steve Burgos from the city of Boise, and Kira Finkler from Trout Unlimited. We're going to hear about how both their professional lives and their organizations are looking at these challenges ahead of us on water resources. When we put this conference together, we were thinking, well, how do we break it out into manageable chunks? How do we steer the themes? And when we looked at water, we said, well, we really can't do just a theme on water because water is part of everything we do. It's part of our bodies, it's part of our lives, it's part of our souls. We can't just separate it out. So you'll hear more about water throughout this conference from other members and other speakers through all the different panels and breakout sessions. But this will be the time that we focus very specifically on how climate change is affecting us here in Idaho. So with that, let me introduce John Bernardo. John is the sustainability strategist for the Idaho Power Company. He identifies and implements sustainability initiatives into the company culture, oversees reporting to national, international, and investment-based organizations, promotes corporate social responsibility, both internally and externally, and manages the production of the company's annual sustainability report. He holds 2 degrees from the Pennsylvania State University, Environmental Resource Management and Biology, and a Master's of Education in Science Education from Clarion University of Pennsylvania. John is also executive in residence at the Boise State University College of Business and Economics. And when he's not doing that, he is an avid mountain biker, an archery enthusiast, and once he even got to play the puzzle on NPR with Will Shortz. So please join me in welcoming John Bernardo. I'll get it for you.
Good morning. It's an honor to be here, and I really appreciate the effort that went into putting this together. This is a very important conversation for Idaho to have, and I'm delighted that it is all of Idaho and not just the Treasure Valley. So welcome to all of you, and again, thank you. Before I talk about drought and water temperature, I want to make sure you understand Idaho Power is the local electric utility. We service Southern Idaho and Eastern Oregon, but we do things a little differently. And I'm going to point this out because I want you to know we are very aware of what's going on and the changes that are occurring. So I'm one of 2,000 employees at this Boise-based 100-year-old electric utility, but I have over 80 colleagues who are scientists. And so our way of handling environmental management, mitigation, predicting when the water is going to come and how much. We have over 80 scientists on staff. That's 4% of our employee base. It's very uncommon in the utility industry. I've got some of my colleagues here today, including one of 3 of our meteorologists, because water's pretty important to us. It's the cheapest way we can generate electricity through our 17 hydro plants, and it's also one of the cleanest ways we can generate electricity. So we need to know what's going on, and I'm talking to those folks all the time, and they're letting me know the changes that are occurring. If you just think about weather as what's occurring outside right now, and the climate as what normally occurs this time of year, we're seeing changes in that normal occurrence. And so to us, very much climate change is real. So the risks that Idaho Power faces regarding climate change are, I'm going to talk about 3 here. Reduce fuel for our hydroelectric generation, wildfires which impact our power lines and our distribution system, and the rising Snake River water temperature, and that also applies to the tributaries of the Snake River. So with the amount of water and when that water comes, that precipitation comes, that's a risk to us. So one of our strategies is to incorporate cloud seeding. Now, I'm proud to say we've been doing cloud seeding long before we looked at it as a strategy to address climate change. It makes sense, and it not only benefits Idaho Power when we get additional precipitation from a winter storm system, it also benefits the agricultural industry, the fisheries industry, even the recreational industry, such as the ski hills. So we continue to do that, and we do it very well. And that's one strategy that we have. I will tell you that when you're 100 years old, you've already figured out, because of the professionals on staff, what the water strategy is, and you work with the state and the irrigators on rights, and you secure those rights, and you have leases to lease water, and we buy water, and we rent water. So it's not like the sun that it's once you build the system, the fuel is free. Not necessarily for hydro, but we certainly do hydro better than we think anybody else around. So cloud seeding is a strategy we're incorporating to address the change in the amount of precipitation, and what also impacts us is when that precipitation occurs. Wildfires impacting our power lines. Absolutely. So we have a service area of 24,000 square miles. A lot of that is desert, and it's mountainous areas, and it's canyon areas. And if we don't have the large transmission lines, which are usually on steel towers, then we have wooden poles. And of course, our business is to keep the electricity running. So when there is an outage from a wildfire, yes, it affects customers. Yes, it affects our business. It also means we put our linemen's lives at risk, because if you think about it, our product is invisible. And if you can see our product, there's a problem. So what we've done, and this is done in areas here in Idaho on BLM land, this is where this picture's taken, we've used vegetation management around the base of the poles. Is there an environmental impact to that? Yes. But we are weighing pros and cons, and it's a balancing issue. If we can keep the fire from getting to the base of the pole, these wildfires usually move pretty quickly in this terrain. And if we can keep that pole from getting to the flash point and the fire moves on, we like to think that we've greatly reduced the potential environmental impact of having to go in there and take that burned pole down, replace it with a new one, and get the service installed again. That takes a fair amount of trucks. And so we use vegetation management where it makes sense. We also use collars that go around the pole. up to a height of about 15 feet, again, to keep the fire from getting to the pole and causing it to burn. Another example, just this is right after a fire, and this is why the pole is still there. Rising Snake River water temperature, we have a very big initiative underway, and some of the folks who are leading that initiative, again, my colleagues are in the room today. This is an effort to reduce the temperature of the Snake River. Now, we could try to add cooler water, or we could try other activities to reduce the temperature of the Snake below our Hell's Canyon Dam, which is the last dam on our system. But what we believe is a more effective manner is a pollution prevention approach. And that is, let's go upstream and try to shade the tributaries and the river with trees. And it's already been mentioned that trees are a great way of sequestering carbon. But in this case, we're trying to reduce the temperature impact. And that also means we reduce the erosion and the sedimentation. I don't know if you've ever been to the Brownlee Dam in Hell's Canyon, which for those of you outside of Idaho, that's the largest canyon in North America. It's the deepest canyon, I should say, not the largest, but the deepest in North America. We have 3 hydro projects there. And the first one is the Brownlee Dam, and everything that's coming off the agricultural fields in Eastern Oregon and Southern Idaho collects at the dam and drops. And so there's a lot of environmental impact there. So whatever we can do upstream to reduce the sedimentation benefits the fish, and it certainly would reduce the water temperature, which is the main reason we want to reduce it, is to keep the fish life going. So we're seeing increases in temperature already. We kind of like the shade effect as one aspect of a strategy to address that. And this is another example of the Snake River Stewardship Project. This is Daly Creek. Sorry, I'm from Pennsylvania. Daly Creek. That's in Eastern Oregon, and it feeds into the Snake River, and you see the strata lines. Those are vegetation plantings that we've started, and then those will, again, provide the shade, and we'll be able to move those and replant them as needed. And the company is even right now working with Boise State students, looking into the feasibility of starting a tree nursery so that we can have locally produced, locally grown trees and shrubs that we can plant along the Snake to address the rising temperature. So those are the 3 areas that we see an impact and the strategies that are on tap right now from Idaho Power. Thank you.
As Tom mentioned earlier, if you have questions for the panelists, please be writing them down on the blue cards, and Boss Hargrove will be picking them up for you at the end of the panelist presentations. Give me one moment here. So please allow me to introduce Kira Finkler with Trout Unlimited, who oversees collaborative projects throughout Idaho that encourage smart water management and meet diverse needs from agriculture and industry to fish and wildlife resources. From 2009 through 2012, she served as the Bureau of Reclamation's Deputy Commissioner in the Department of the Interior. She led the agency's efforts to create a successful partnership with USDA Natural Resource Conservation Service for improving efficiency of agricultural water use, increased the hiring of young people by more than 66% over a 3-year period, and began to identify and measure climate change adaptation actions. She has a total of 12 years of experience as a staff person in the U.S. Senate. Beginning in 2003, she spent 4 years as Government Affairs Director for Trout Unlimited. She has served on the board of the Sustainable Northwest, the Penobscot River Restoration Trust, and the Idaho chapter of the Nature Conservancy. She holds a JD from American University and a BA in Political Science from the University of Arizona. Please welcome Kira Finkler and her presentation on planning for and adapting to changes in water availability, water quality, and precipitation in Idaho.
Good morning. I also feel so lucky to be here and be a part of this incredible discussion that you're all going to be having over the next 2 days. Trout Unlimited is the nation's oldest and largest cold water conservation organization. We have about 2,000 members in Idaho, and they're organized into chapters, and there are 9 chapters throughout the state. So today I'm going to just describe a few examples of climate change impacts to cold water fisheries. And then I'm going to describe for you Trout Unlimited's strategy to plan for and adapt to those impacts. And then I'm going to give you 4 examples of how we're implementing our strategy in the state. Trout and salmon depend on an abundant supply of clean and cold water every day. And unfortunately, one of the impacts of climate change is increased water temperature. Bull trout require very cold water for spawning and rearing. And researchers at the Forest Service have estimated that up to 92% of native bull trout habitat will be lost due to climate change. Climate change also impacts the timing and type of precipitation. Snowpack is a natural form of water storage. The Bureau of Reclamation recently submitted a report to Congress, and they estimated that snowpacks are projected to decrease for almost all of the western United States. This affects things such as aquatic insects, which are an important food source. So for example, mayflies emerge earlier when snow melts sooner, and those mayflies are smaller and the females lay fewer eggs. Finally, I think it's always important to remember that climate change is impacting systems that a lot of times are already stressed by other factors. For example, drought. Drought conditions make trout, particularly cutthroat trout, more susceptible to invasive species and disease. So climate change really increases those cumulative impacts of those other stressors. So the good news is that trout and salmon are remarkably resilient creatures. If the habitats that they depend on are healthy, trout and salmon can persist. Trout Unlimited has come up with a science-based strategy to improve watershed health. First, protect the remaining high-quality habitats. Second, reconnect rivers and their tributaries. Third, restore degraded riparian areas and channels. And then you'll see sustain underlies all of those components, and I'll circle back to that in a few minutes. And really the core of this strategy for us is to work with governmental agencies, tribes, landowners, private companies, and a lot of other partners to work together and help rebuild the natural resilience of watersheds. So the first example I want to share with you is Sheep Creek, which is in the Upper Blackfoot in Idaho. And you can see that some of the habitat, there was shallower and wider channel. And here you can see the before and after of the project work. And projects like this one really restore the hydrologic processes by reconnecting the stream to its floodplain and also restoring natural channel form. So here you can see the meanders. And these projects also really restore the stream's ability to absorb flood flows. And that's important because the riparian area acts as a sponge and can soak up those flood flows and then slowly release that water throughout the summer. I wanted to talk about another project that actually was just completed last week, the Wimpy Creek project in the Lemhi River Basin, because it's a really good example that this type of work can often create family wage jobs in local areas. The Bureau of Reclamation's Lewiston Orchards project is operated and maintained by the Lewiston Orchards Irrigation District. And currently the project gets its water for irrigation by diverting surface water from streams. Most of the project's infrastructure is on the Nez Perce Reservation. And there was ongoing litigation for many years because clearly the project was in conflict with tribal interests, including impacts to steelhead. In 2008, a community leader, Jerry Clem, brought the tribe, the district, and the Bureau of Reclamation together. And they all agreed to try and solve 3 longstanding problems, including inadequate water supply for the district. Snowpack was decreasing in part because of climate change, and that was impacting the reliability of the water supply for the district. They all also agreed to try to look at and solve the issues related to the adverse impacts on the tribe, as well as steelhead. And litigation was stayed while a comprehensive solution was pursued. So working together, they developed an innovative water exchange. And the plan essentially involves exchanging the surface water system with an off-reservation groundwater pump system. And the wells will be constructed in phases as funds are available. And there's going to be essentially a bucket for bucket exchange, whereas once each well comes online, then an equal amount of water will be returned to the streams. And there'll be many benefits as a result of this collaborative plan that they came up with, including that it's really going to increase the climate change resilience of steelhead, because the streams that are benefiting from the water coming back to them are also fed by springs that keep that water cool year round, that are really important for steelhead. And again, one of the keys of this project is that it's implemented in phases, so you can have benefits for people and fish along the way. The last example I want to share with you is a tool that we use to help prioritize our work, because we all are limited by budgets and resources, so it's really important to prioritize. My colleague Peter Anderson, who's here today, and you should seek him out if you have more questions, he worked with an awesome colleague of ours, Dr. Helen Neville, who's also here today, and they took a look at the climate shield analysis that was done by Dr. Dan Isaac at the Forest Service's Rocky Mountain Research Station. And that analysis helps pinpoint habitats in Idaho with the highest probability of providing native fish habitat under a warming climate. And Peter and our science team integrated that climate shield analysis with the state of Idaho's water rights records. And that really helped everyone to see if there are particular stream basins that have water rights that perhaps we should investigate further a potential water transaction. And there's also additional information at our booth. So in conclusion, I just wanted to come back to that sustain part of our strategy. The local chapter here in Boise is called the Ted Trueblood chapter, and they host a trout camp every summer. Sustain is really about providing opportunities for people of all ages to learn about fish and rivers and streams, to enjoy them, and to better understand them. Thank you.
Let me now introduce you to Steve Burgos, the City of Boise Public Works Director. Steve has experience including over 20 years in the environmental industry as a private consultant and now as Public Service Director for the City of Boise. His department's responsibilities include wastewater collection and treatment, trash collection, recycling and composting, managing and sustainability planning, management of the city's geothermal heating system, water resources planning, and providing engineering support for public streetlights, stormwater drainage. hillside protection, floodplain review, and construction management. Basically, everything that makes the city work from an infrastructure perspective. Steve is a graduate of Duke University with a degree in civil and environmental engineering and a veteran of the U.S. Navy. So please welcome Steve to the podium.
Well, good morning. Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity to be in front of you all. I see a lot of familiar faces out there. And for those of you that know me, you know I really dig my job. I have a cool job. And part of that is because there's these pretty vexing challenges that are out there. And I really, part of what's so invigorating about the work that we do is that we really have to think, yes, we frame the problem, but we really have to think about solutions and what do those look like. So while I'll spend a little bit of time on some of the challenges that we face related to water and climate change, I want to get a little bit more towards some of the solutions that we're looking at. It was hard when I was told I had to just talk on water and what the city's doing about water related to climate change. It's really hard because we have so many other things going on that I wanted to talk about. But just quickly, I just want to mention my boss is really big on when we sign up for something. He's not real big on just setting goals for goals' sake. He's really big on if we sign up for something, we're going to make a commitment and we're going to start getting after it. And so we signed on to the Mayor's Agreement on Climate Change. And in that climate change agreement, there's several local actions that we've been asked to take on. And I'm happy to report that we're making progress on all of those. And one of those is related back to water. But before we get to that, there was some discussion about transportation. We're looking at transit issues. We're looking at, we've added about 8 electric vehicles to our fleet. We have our new eco district downtown, the Live District, where we're experimenting on sustainability issues. And then we built the state of Idaho's first commercial zero net energy building, which is performing amazingly well. It's actually net positive at this point. So we're really excited about those issues and the projects that we have going there. But specifically to water resources, last year, the city, we completed a Boise climate adaptation assessment. And that was really to tell us what are the specific issues that Boise is going to face as a city when we start to consider the impacts of climate change. And so Dr. John Abatsoglu from the U of I did the analysis for us. He looked at approximately 20 climate models. And of the top 8 issues that came out of that study, 6 of the 8 were related back to water in some shape or form, whether it was drought, whether it was increased flood risk, any number of issues related back to water. And so our response to that, talking to mayor and council, we made the case that we needed to have somebody, while we do focus on certain water issues, we don't have anybody that's just looking at the total picture of water. And so we were given the green light to hire John Roldan, who's going to be our strategic water resources manager. And fundamentally, what we've asked John to take on is let's get out of our silos. We have allowed ourselves, certainly in the public sector, to get into these silos of wastewater, of stormwater, of drinking water. And in part because of the regulatory framework that we're under, we've created these silos that really have hindered our ability to plan in between these different water supplies. And so what John's going to be taking on is this idea of one water. It really is just one water. It's a finite amount of water on the earth. There aren't different types per se. It's all one water. And so it's really focused on breaking down barriers across the water sectors and getting more proactive about planning this resiliency to deal with what we think is coming in the coming decades. And so the idea that we would get past stormwater, get past wastewater, get past irrigation, that it's all one water and we need to start integrating the management of those resources. So I want to zoom in on one particular segment of this kind of one water concept, and it's going back to wastewater. And so at the city of Boise, we get about 30 million gallons a day of used water from our community, from industry, from residents, et cetera, that comes to our facilities. We treat about 30 million gallons a day to a very high level. And at this point, we discharge it back to the Boise River. We also pull back out the biosolids from that used water. And we have a 4,300 acre farm south of town that we apply those biosolids for local crop production. We remove the phosphorus. We're the first city in the US to have a Class A struvite facility where we take out the phosphorus from the waste stream and it's a chemical process and we put it back out on the market as fertilizer. The methane that we produce at these facilities, we're recovering for heat at the facility, and we're doing a lot of research and development at these facilities to figure out how we can do all these things better, more efficiently. So I would suggest to you that there's not a whole lot of waste in this wastewater. And so one of the things that we're really focused on moving forward is resource recovery when we start thinking of quote unquote wastewater. And so you're going to hear more about this. We are transitioning the language with which we use to describe the work that happens at these facilities. It's not wastewater, it's not sewage, it's not a treatment works, it's not nutrient removal. We really want to change the dialogue with our citizens, with key stakeholders on what we can and can't do with these things and the opportunities that are out there. So you're going to hear things like water renewal fund instead of a sewer fund, water renewal facilities, resource management, nutrient recovery, not nutrient removal. Because it's really important. We have some big questions that we're going to be facing in the coming years on water supply. We can be a part of that solution via water renewal, but in order for our citizens to engage in that conversation, we have to be able to communicate back to them what actually happens at these facilities. And once we get that done, I think we'll get a better sense for what our community wants. Boiseans typically will pay more for improved outcomes. They like value-based decisions. I'd point to the Foothills levy as a great example of the value-based decisions. Yes, we forgot to collect the levy. I know that. But the revote was 84% the second time around. So that was really a kind of a sign to us. In government, we often assume that people want least cost options. I'm here to tell you that Boiseans don't want least cost. They want best value. And so what we're trying to frame on the water renewal side is what is the best value. So when we do our big strategic planning, in the past, it would be how fast are we growing and what are the regulatory requirements from under the Clean Water Act that come from EPA. And at that point, we typically in the past called it good. Let's build a new clarifier, a new digester. But what we're adding to the mix now is resource recovery. Resource recovery because that's really what's happening at these facilities, and we need to be more deliberate about how we're pulling those resources back out of the water. And so through our LIVE framework, the Lasting, Innovative, Vibrant framework, we are actively planning the utility of the future. So what does that look like? We're going to be carbon neutral. We're going to be resource focused. We're going to be data driven. We're going to promote economic development. And I'll talk about how we might do that here in a second. But it really is a different way of looking at one of the components of that one water, the used water side. How do we do that differently? How do we do it more efficiently? And what are the resources that we can offer back to our community to help address some of these climate change issues? So what's an example of what we might do? So here's a look at the West Boise Water Renewal Facility. Currently, we're discharging highly treated effluent back to the Boise River. A good outcome because we're treating it to a very high level. But what if, moving into the future, maybe we wanted to treat that water differently to a Class A level and say make it available to a canal company or irrigation company that might need additional water as we get further into potential drought issues. Or what if we wanted to take that water and store it in the aquifer, put it in the aquifer via infiltration for when those drought conditions come up, we'll have almost like we will have a storage facility for our water. And then if we were going to do that, what if we made some of that water that's going maybe south of town available for economic development? So data centers, huge water intensive industry. If that water is going south in a big pipeline, maybe we let a company like Amazon or HP pop a straw into that pipeline and use that water. And what if, way off into the future, we start using that water for drinking? In the industry, we call it direct potable reuse. That's what happens when engineers are allowed to market things. Direct potable reuse really rolls off the tongue. But the intent is that you would take this water and you would use it for drinking, right? So the number one issue that's limiting us on this is not the technology. We have that today. It's not the regulations. We're working on those, and California's working very quickly on those. The number one issue is the yuck factor. People just cringing when they think about the idea of using used water for a drinking water source. So these are the types of things that we're looking at from a strategic standpoint. We're in the middle of a big strategic planning process for our water renewal fund. And so these are questions that will help address some of those climate change risk issues that came out of our assessment that was completed last year. And then last but not least, I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about temperature mitigation, and it's been touched on already. I appreciated Kira's comments. We are trying to get back to a river system that functions more like it was intended to function. And so sometimes we get hung up on green infrastructure and we think about either solar panels or green stormwater infrastructure. I would submit to you that the Boise River is the most important and prized piece of green infrastructure that we have in Boise. And so how do we, thanks. So that river has changed. It's a highly managed system, and we've channelized it. So what are the things that we can do from a temperature mitigation standpoint to reintroduce some of those side channels, to add vegetation, to add the tree canopy that has these other ancillary benefits? So we are currently working with EPA, who has been very open to the approach of a concept called 316A under the Clean Water Act, which would basically allow us to avoid putting chillers at the end of a treatment plant. That is probably the worst outcome I can think of when we're trying to deal with temperature, in-stream temperature issues. And so in lieu of those chillers, we're looking at things like restoration, tree canopy, side channel, improving the hyporheic zones within our Boise River system. And so, yes, temperature is a big issue. Yes, we're trying to address it, but we're trying to address it in a way that's very innovative, much like we've heard previously from Idaho Power, Trout Unlimited. It's a new world, and we're thinking differently about how we can deal with these issues, what's more natural, getting back to almost where we were before, in a more natural state. And with that, I'll complete my talk. Thank you.
So if you are starting to have questions, raise your hand up and Bass will try to find you and collect that card and bring it forward. I'll warn you that I have at least one question I'm going to start with for the panel, so we'll get there. It is my pleasure now to introduce you to Lynn Tominaga, our last panelist. Lynn has over 30 years experience in Idaho agriculture, water, and natural resource issues. He's executive director of the Idaho Groundwater Appropriators Association, the Idaho Groundwater Association, and Idaho Irrigation Pumpers Association. Anything to do with groundwater, talk to Lynn. He is active on the Natural Resource Conservation State Advisory Committee, IDEQ Citizen Drinking Water Advisory Committee, IDEQ Technical Groundwater Committee, Idaho Power Citizen Advisory Committee, Idaho Power Risk Management Team, and IDWR's Technical Groundwater Committee, and a member of the Executive Board of Idaho Food Producers. Prior to forming his own company, Lynn was also a water policy analyst for the Idaho Water Users Association for 9 years, and also did his time as a 4-term state senator in the Idaho legislature. So please welcome Lynn Tominaga.
First, I need to do a disclaimer. One, I do not work for the Department of Water Resources because most of the slides that I have stolen are from the department. Second, I stole them because if we would have had to we would just have had to recreate most of the information and put it under our name. And since this is all state information, it's unbiased, or hopefully represents both sides. I was thinking of what Kira was saying during her discussion, and maybe Trout Unlimited needs to take a look at changing their name to Bass Unlimited or Perch Unlimited if we don't solve some of the problems that we have in terms of temperature, because as you know, those fish can live in a little bit higher temperatures than we currently have. This first slide is just, and I'm going to go through the slides fairly quickly so that there'll be more time for questions, because I already see a bunch of blue cards being held up. The first question I always ask when I get in front of a group like this is, since I work with a lot of attorneys, how many attorneys are in the audience? Okay. Well, that's not bad. That means I can say a lot of things and not get in trouble. But this just tells you the extent of the Eastern Snake Plain aquifer and the area that it has. I just hit. And a lot of these slides are on the website. And so, like I said, I'm going to go through them pretty quickly. And if you want more information about some of the facts. But as you can see that agriculture has a very large impact upon the state. In fact, with the food processing and the agriculture production, it makes up almost 20% or over 20% of the state's gross state product. So impacting agriculture in this state has a large impact. This information shows what's happened over the last 100 years. Up until the 1950s, we were actually putting more water back into the aquifer than we were actually taking out. But over the last 60 years, we've seen a decline on an average of about 220,000 acre feet a year. The reason for a lot of the changes that we've seen is because of drought, increase in conservation. Most people think that conservation is a good thing, but what we've seen is most of the surface water irrigation has gone from flood or what we call furrow irrigation to sprinklers. And that's very efficient, and it doesn't allow water to seep into the aquifer. We also have what they call the water savings program with the Bureau of Reclamation. When they built Palisades Reservoir, on average, there used to be 1 million acre feet that ran in the canal systems during the wintertime. And that would actually seep into the aquifer during the wintertime. Well, how much is 1 million acre feet? Well, if you take here in the Treasure Valley, if you take Anderson Ranch, Arrow Rock Reservoir, Lucky Peak, and Lake Lowell, that's about 1 million acre feet. So for the last 50 years, 60 years, 1 million acre feet has not been going back into the aquifer because of water that's being stored in Palisades Reservoir, and the irrigators use that water in Palisades for summertime flows. But another one of the reasons is we have more groundwater irrigation. And this one shows the amount of groundwater that's been developed since the 1940s. And drought has played a very large part of what's going on in the state. They have what is called the Surface Water Supply Index. This is over the last 30 years of what's been going on. But over the last 15, from about 2000 to 2015, we've had 10 years of drought over that, from 2000 to 2015. And they were severe drought. It wasn't just a little drought, it was major drought. This just shows you the makeup of the organization that I represent. We represent over 1 million acres of irrigated groundwater across the Eastern Snake Plain aquifer. Well, in 2015, we kind of hit a perfect storm in that because of low reservoir space, the running into that 15 years of drought or 10 years of major drought. And we are a prior appropriation state that says first in time, first in right. The water supply for irrigation for both groundwater and surface water was in great peril. And since the groundwater users are junior to the senior surface water users, there was a good percentage of the irrigated groundwater was going to be curtailed administratively because of the not enough water for the surface or the senior water right holder. And this basically shows what would have happened if in 2015, if we didn't come to an agreement. For the previous 10 years, we had been in legal battles with the surface water users. And during that time period, we'd spent a lot of money, and on average, each side spent about $1 million a year in legal and technical expense. And then the state of Idaho, to fend us both off, was spending probably $1 million. So we were spending pretty close to $3 million a year fighting legal problems, both technical, and the issue then became, it didn't really solve. It wasn't for solutions. It was for legal, basically setting new water law in the state of Idaho. But it didn't help the situation. We did a settlement agreement, and I have to say thank you to Speaker Bedke and State Senator Steve Baer. They helped both the groundwater and the surface water users get together to do a settlement agreement. That settlement agreement calls for a number of things, and the agreement is again on the website, so I won't go into any detail. But the reason one of the ways that we're going to tell whether we're going to improve the aquifer or to have a sustainable supply is that we picked 19 sentinel wells across the eastern Snake Plain. And the little green dots there represent the 19 sentinel wells. The reason we pick sentinel wells is that because the river system fluctuates so widely during the year, there was no way of being able to tell whether or not we were building the aquifer or not. So these 19 sentinel wells have a long history of water measurement, over 35 years. The state, as well as the groundwater users, have a model that shows what happens if we were to do two things. One is reduce the groundwater consumption by 240,000 acre feet a year, and if the state of Idaho recharges 250,000 acre feet a year. So between the two, the groundwater model shows that within a 10-year period, we'll raise the aquifer by about 10 feet. And so that in itself is going to be our goal or accomplishment. The accomplishment is if we don't get there, we're not going to have a sustainable water supply. Idaho Power comes into the mix of all of this. Back in 1984, there was a Swan Falls Agreement. The agreement says that the state of Idaho guarantees Idaho Power minimum flows at Swan Falls of 3,900 CFS during the summertime from April through October, and a wintertime flow of 5,600 CFS from November through March. That's important because, as you know, 50% of the power generated by Idaho Power in this state comes from hydropower. And so the agreement is very important, not only to Idaho Power, but to the people of the state of Idaho to keep their electrical rates low. Okay. Now to show you some interesting things that we have been able to show. I just added these the last few days. Out of the 19 Sentinel wells, we're beginning to see an increase already with the state doing the recharge that it's done and the groundwater users doing reductions and also recharge. We're beginning to see a buildup of the aquifer. In fact, that just shows what our expected timeline was during the 10 years, and we're already beginning to see an increase. Now, some would say it's because of the winter that we had the last 2 years, but I think it's going to be a combination of both. But one of the things in helping build a sustainable water supply is the water availability, because you can't recharge if the water does not come into priority. This particular graph shows that the amount of water that could be recharged from, say, 2000 to 2014, there's almost 11 million acre feet that went past Milner Dam. That if we had the infrastructure or the facilities to recharge that, a lot of that could have gone back into the ground and helped build the aquifer in our state. The top upper chart shows the amount of water that could be recharged above American Falls Reservoir. And again, we're taking a look at almost 3 million acre feet of water that could be recharged if we have the infrastructure to be able to do that. And that's one of the things that we're seeing more and more as a commitment to the state to go and recharge it. For example, this year in the Boise River system, if we were able to take the water that flowed past in the Boise River system of 9,000 CFS a day, that's 2 million acre feet. If we could have recharged that somewhere, whether it's in Southwest Boise or if we could have gotten out in the desert, it would have meant more sustainable water supplies for the future of the state. But we just don't have the infrastructure to get that much water out there. And that's probably the biggest message. Last but not least, this just shows you what the Idaho Water Resource Board has been doing this last year. They recharged over 317,000 acre feet. And these are the different locations where they did the recharge. This last slide, and then I'll finish, maybe I'll tell my joke too at the same time, is in 2015, we had almost 3,700 wells that were being measured by the use of electricity. They have what is called a PCC, which is the power coefficient. But it's not very accurate if you have complicated multi-systems. There's as much as a plus or minus 20% in the amount of water that you're measuring. As part of the settlement agreement that we did with the surface water users, we committed to putting flow meters on those 3,700 wells that are not presently metered. The average cost of installation and the meters is over $6,000 per installation. So what you're really looking at is almost $20 million that is being borne by the groundwater users, that it doesn't increase the yields of their crops. It doesn't do anything other than makes sure that we are more accurate in measuring the amount of water that we use and that we meet the reduction that we have agreed to in the settlement agreement. With that, we'll open it up for questions.
Thank you, Lynn. Thank you, panelists, and thank you for all the people who have submitted questions. I'll apologize in advance. We have about 5 minutes here for questions now, so we're not going to get to many of them. I'll start off with the first one, though, which was addressed to John Bernardo and Steve Burgos. The others are welcome to join in. If current trends continue, climate models indicate an increase of over 20 100-degree days and 18 days above 105 degrees in Boise. I think that goes across the state as well. High heat translates into high energy demand for cooling, which for Idaho Power also potentially translates into more demand for water. What are the opportunities to meet or mitigate that demand, both from the city and the power perspective?
This is working. Okay. Well, we try to have the water ready when we need it, but in the summertime, it is hard. And if it's that hot, that means we're losing a lot to evaporation. So we always go to fallback, and that is we still generate using coal. We still generate using gas. And every year we are taking more privately produced renewable energy generation into our portfolio. So that's solar, that's wind, anaerobic digestion, geothermal. So it is it's a balancing act, but that's how we would be able to manage it.
Yeah, I would just add in that in addition to what John said, at the city level, I think a huge part of it is energy efficiency. So those peaks that are coming, the more energy efficiency that we can promote, the lower those peaks will be. And so one of the things that I learned when you saw the picture of that zero net energy building, if you saw the roof, only about a third of the roof had PVs on it, panels. And the reason why that is because that building is crazy efficient. When we designed it, it has about a 13 energy use intensity. And so what that means is there's just less demand from that building, right? So the energy efficient, what I'm learning, I'm no energy expert, but what I'm learning is energy efficiency first, and then pivot to renewables. Those backside renewables can be half as much. And so when we start talking about shaving demand, we have those little tools, energy efficiency tools that we need to start using and being more aggressive about. I think it's probably the most cost-effective resource in the resource stack. It also has all these ancillary benefits of reducing the peak.
I think I can squeeze in one more question before I get knocked off the board here. This one's for Kira. Summer base flows are rapidly falling in headwater streams as winter snow increasingly comes as rain in the mid-elevations. Seemingly no amount of habitat restoration can protect the fishery if there isn't enough for any water. Are there opportunities to address replacing critical cold water summer base flows?
Definitely. That's part of our strategy with, talking about reconnecting the river to tributaries. Part of the way you can do that is with flows. We work a lot with agricultural producers across the state on, for example, water conservation, or also potentially, in a willing seller, willing buyer opportunity to lease water. So I do feel like there is a lot of opportunities to help with the flow issue as well.
Well, I think we're out of time because I could ask one more question that could take us for the rest of the day, which would be what happens when water flow in the Snake flows below Idaho Power's right at Swan Falls Dam and we start over again. But we won't go there today.
Ready.
You're ready? 30 seconds, go.
Well, sure. We have the legal right because of the Snake River Water Adjudication Agreement that we've got to have minimum flows. If you don't have minimum flows, the procedure is you go to Idaho Department of Water Resources and you make what's called a call, where you're saying you've got to shut off users upstream until we get our minimum flow again. But that impacts people. That impacts farmers. That impacts the city of Kimberly and Buell. And we're not going to just do that because we have the legal right to do that. So that's why we spend every day looking for more water and working with folks like the Groundwater Users Association. We're looking for alternatives to that.
Okay, alternatives is what we are going to be talking about this afternoon in all the breakouts, how we're going to find solutions to this. A big hand for our panelists, and thank you.
Your presentation was really good.
Thank you. And a reminder, one more panel before lunch. It's the true cost of wildfire. So I'd like to make a transition here for the next panelists. And thanks to all the existing panelists here. And while they're approaching the podium, I introduced David New before, but I will remind our folks here that he is with the Snake River chapter of Society of American